tolir, donc cœur, pensée, désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre, ne mourir, puis à ce jour. Si ne me doit à vouloir tourner ce jeu, vous amour, car son...
Welcome to Chapter 2, Episode 3, Petrarch Makes a Name for Himself. Last time we looked at the emergence of the French Ars Nova and the great literary work, the Roman de Fauvel. This time we're going to further explore the characteristics of the Ars Nova, and we'll be doing it through works connected to two of those important crises of the 14th century. A crisis in the conception of the self and of humankind's relation to the divine, as well as the crisis of the Black Death. We'll start that discussion by looking at the life and works of Petrarch.
So Petrarch, as most people know, was the first poet laureate to be named in the medieval world for almost 1,000 years, since the collapse of the Roman Empire. And he was named poet laureate because he had established a significant reputation as a great writer, not just of poetry, but of political tracts and all kinds of other works. What's really important to know about Petrarch, and to make clear that it's not just that he's amazing, but that the time is right to have produced him, is that both Paris and Rome at the same time asked him to be poet laureate. So what that tells us is that medieval society has evolved to a point where there is a greater appreciation for the arts, for leisure, indeed, because Petrarch is also considered by many to be the first tourist. He traveled places because he wanted to. I imagine some people did that before Petrarch, but he is sort of the culmination of the idea of traveling for travel's sake, of learning for learning's sake. And on one of his voyages, he would visit monasteries, libraries, and we can all be grateful to Petrarch because he found a stash of letters written by Cicero that had been lost since the collapse of the Roman Empire. And because Petrarch was interested in learning ancient Greek, in studying ancient Latin, and reviving the classics, he was always on the lookout for important texts from those periods that had been lost. At the same time, in his poetry, we see a slight shift from what we might see in, say, troubadour poetry. So, for example, in troubadour poetry, poems to the beauty of the lady and her brilliance and her graciousness, pretty much any noble lady could be interchanged with any other noble lady as the subject of that poem. But with Petrarch, in his songs for Laura, he starts to use for the first time what some scholars have said, the psychological realism of love. We don't get clear descriptions of Laura herself in terms of how she looks, although he does describe her foot at one point. But what we do get is a much more sincere and believable rendering of the poet's emotions in terms of his love for her. The troubadours were clearly moving from court to court and singing their songs, and they could sing them to any person about any person, and they were pretty much interchangeable, although they were still beautiful works of art. Petrarch's songs for Laura were truly individualized works that spoke to a specific feeling and relationship. And we can actually trace, in a direct line, I would argue, a line from Petrarch all the way to Shakespeare. And in fact, to Shakespeare's famous sonnet, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." Because for so long, like in the troubadour tradition, sonnets to one's loved one would tend to exaggerate how beautiful the loved one was. And in something called a blason, those sonnets would move through all the physical attributes of the beloved. So her eyes are like sapphires, Her lips are like rubies. Her cheeks are like roses, right? So all these conventions. But what Petrarch set the foundation for was the possibility that Shakespeare, centuries later, could write a poem about his mistress in which he says, yeah, her skin's not beautiful alabaster white, and her hair is not glorious and lustrous. It's kind of wiry. But his love for her is that much greater because she is a real woman. And so I think we can see this development in terms of love poetry. Petrarch is sort of the apogee of it in the 14th century when he becomes poet laureate, but he's building on earlier traditions. And we can follow what he did and trace its development all the way through to Shakespeare and much more realistic love poetry.
As Professor Armstrong has so eloquently expressed, Petrarch plays an important role in the development of psychological realism in Western literature, on the path from the troubadours through Dante and leading to Shakespeare. And as we have already seen in this course, the 14th century shows interesting turns in the representation of the self in art. Both Giotto and Marchetto of Padua figured themselves into their own artworks at Scrovegni Chapel. Dante appears as a character in his own Divine Comedy, and we will see Guillaume de Machaut memorializing himself in this episode. So, how did Petrarch's life and work shape representation of the self? Francesco Petrarca was born in Arezzo in 1304 and lived from an early age in Carpentras near Avignon in southern France. His father was a notary and followed the papal court of Clement V to Avignon in 1312. Petrarch disliked the legal education and career his father urged on him, so instead he followed his love of Latin literature and ancient manuscripts, which led him on a famous trip through Paris, Flanders, and the Rhine Valley in his late 20s, in search of adventure and manuscripts, a spirit that would shape his life as a writer, scholar, and international poet-diplomat. On April 26, 1336, Petrarch summited Mont Ventoux, a mountain of 6,273 feet just outside Avignon. Petrarch records this climb in a letter and notes that at the summit he opened a small book of St. Augustine's Confessions that he carried with him, and opened it, by chance, he says, to this passage. And men go about to wander at the heights of the mountains, and the mighty waves of the sea, and the wide sweep of rivers, and the circuit of the ocean, and the revolution of the stars. But themselves they consider not. And then Petrarch started his descent. About the descent, he writes in the letter, "Then, in truth, I was satisfied that I had seen enough of the mountain. I turned my inward eye upon myself, and from that time not a syllable fell from my lips until we reached the bottom again. We look about us for what is to be found only within. How many times, think you, did I turn back that day to glance at the summit of the mountain, which seemed scarcely a cubit high compared with the range of human contemplation?" Though most of Petrarch's vast corpus of writings are in Latin, including the epic poem Africa that won him European celebrity and the title of Poet Laureate, his fame and name come down to the modern world largely through his poetry in Italian. Known in Italian as Il Canzoniere, that is, the songbook, and also as the Rime Sparsi, or scattered verses. In Latin, the same collection is officially known as the Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, or Fragments of Vernacular Poetry. In each of these titles, emphasis is on the broken form, a collection, scattered, fragmented. This collection of lyric poems expresses Petrarch's passionate love for a woman named Laura in 366 poems which draw out the instability and fragmentation of the self as the individual suffers desire. As the poet draws the eye inward, the self shatters into contradictions, paradoxes, and fragments, and the story of the self, as experienced through time, desire, and death, is told through the pieces. About this structure in Petrarch's lyric poetry, Professor Giuseppe Mazzotta of Yale University writes, "The canzoniere is, to be sure, the attempt to restore the pieces, to give an illusory unity to the fragments. The 366 poems, the days of the year plus one, simulate the eternal calendar of love, a symbolic order imposed on the fragmentation of time. But the fragments remain as such, rime sparse. The point of the work is that the unity of the work is the unity of fragments in fragments. It is from a fragmented self represented in this fragmented work, this inward turn, and the lifelong project of collecting and making sense of the scattered manuscripts of the ancient world, that Petrarch crafted a name for himself, and is recognized as a bridge from the Middle Ages into the rise of humanism and the Italian Renaissance. Over his lifetime, Petrarch carefully crafted and revised his writings and reputation, and in his 1364 letter to his friend Boccaccio, Petrarch even rightly predicted his own place in Italian literary history, second only to Dante, with a reputation and name he made for himself.
Guillaume de Machaut is a fascinating and central figure in the 14th century. His Messe de Notre Dame is the first complete polyphonic setting of the entire Mass Ordinary and utilizes isorhythm, a technique borrowed from the motet genre. It is also musically connected by a common theme throughout: extensive use of Marian musical materials, such as plain chant associated with various Marian feasts. Up until this time, cathedral choirs would pick and choose polyphonic settings of the Mass by different composers, so you end up with a kind of hodgepodge with no linkage between the movements. Why did Machaut write a unified work? Well, the answer is very personal. He wrote it to be sung in a Mass commemorating his own death. Dr. Fasser says, quote, "Machaut was increasingly careful in the preparation of his works to create a legacy of remembrance. He is the first composer we know of who built his own musical monument and arranged for its endowment and performance after his death," end quote. We chose not to perform this Mass for this course, partially because we know this work is widely available in recordings and we wanted to share some other works. It is an important work, and we encourage you to explore it more deeply through recordings and further readings. We'll offer some suggestions in the comments and in our course booklet. I mention the Mass here because it is part and parcel of Machaut's life and life's work. Machaut is known both as a poet and a composer, and he is a consummate storyteller. His group of 17 motets, Dr. Fasser tells us, quote, "represent the mystical journey of a pilgrim's soul toward a sense of union with the triune God," end quote. We discussed a very similar journey last episode with Dante's Divine Comedy. For Machaut, the Messe de Notre Dame is his personal capstone on that journey. So let's turn our attention to the first motet in that collection of 17 motets, a beginning of sorts of Machaut's story, for this is where he experiences first love. Quant à moi is, like the Philippe de Vitry work we heard last episode, an isorhythmic motet. Like that work, it contains repeated rhythmic and melodic patterns, the teleia and color, that, when put in various combinations or permutations, form larger structures, an architecture, if you will. And you will remember that we first encountered the motet back in the Ars Antiqua, the School of Notre Dame in Paris, when we first get simple two-voice polyphony. This motet is in 3 voices, and each has its own text. The triplum, or highest voice, describes falling in love and then having to suffer the bitterness of being made to wait. The poet says, "I shall have without end the joy with which love must reward a perfect lover for his troubles. but she is making the wait too long. And then, just a little bit later, and that is why I say as I sigh, what great madness this love is, which turns a sweet song into a bitter one. Machaut is making a play on two similar sounding words here, between amour, love, and amer, bitter. Much like the work of Giotto, Dante, and Petrarch, Machaut's work looks at the human story and, in this case, looks at a divided self, a crisis of the self, a tension between sweetness and bitterness, joy and pain, living and dying. Let's listen to Quant à moi. If you'd like to follow the texts in the piece, be sure to follow along in the course booklet, which is linked in the comments below. Maybe listen once to follow the triplum, once to follow the duplum, and once again to hear how they interact with each other and the tenor. Let's now examine another of Machaut's great works, the Remède de Fortune, or The Remedy of Fortune. This tells the story of courtly life, possibly autobiographical, from the time when Machaut served, as Dr. Fassler teaches us, quote, John of Luxembourg, King of Bohemia, and his daughter Bonne, the wife of the man who would be crowned John II of France. The work is dedicated to Bonne, who died in the plague in 1348, months before her husband became king, end quote. For more on the Black Death, let's listen to expert Dr. Dorsey Armstrong.
What the Black Death does is wipe out up to half the population of medieval Europe. And a lot of those people were particularly vulnerable because they had been weakened by famine, because for a couple generations they and their families had been living sort of on the margins of society. And so they were not in a position, they were not healthy enough or strong enough or robust enough to counter this plague when it swept through the medieval world. And it swept through with such virulence. I've been asked several times lately to comment on what similarities I see between the plague in the 14th century and the current coronavirus pandemic. And one thing I like to tell people that I find reassuring, and I hope to give them a sense of optimism, is that after the plague in the 14th century, in many ways, society improved, and those who survived were better off than they had been before. At the same time, a lot of the things we're seeing with coronavirus, we all still see in the Middle Ages if we look at the 14th century. Conspiracy theories as to what is causing this virus. In the 14th century, there were lots of people who were looking for a scapegoat, and they blamed Jewish communities. And some horrible retribution and outright murder of several Jewish communities happened in medieval Europe in the 14th century. Of course, the Jews were not responsible for some plot to spread plague throughout the medieval world, but people were hoping to identify a scapegoat, because otherwise the answer was, we have no idea what this is. And that's terrifying. We see the same thing happening today with some people trying to blame certain areas of the world as having fostered the coronavirus and not kept a lid on it. And also, what we see today is that many of the systemic problems of our society that had been sort of papered over or covered up or kept quiet, you can't do that anymore in the middle of a crisis. In the middle of a crisis, all of the flaws of our systems in our society become much more obvious, become much clearer. And the hope is that if we can see all the problems, that perhaps we can start to take steps to fix them. And so that is me trying to see the silver lining behind coronavirus, which has devastated so many people, my own family included. So I know that it's a serious, horrible situation, but also, as a medievalist, I have what I like to call plague or pandemic perspective. And in the 14th century, if one contracted the plague, mortality rates were 80%. And when I talked to a friend of mine who is a doctor who's on the front lines with the COVID crisis right now, she stopped me and she said, "Wait, 8?" And I said, "No, 80." And she said, "18?" I said, "No, 80." And she said, "Oh my goodness," because that's nowhere near where we are with coronavirus. And humanity came back, society came back after the Black Death, so we can hope that when we get coronavirus under control, with its numbers being much lower, as devastating and tragic as it is, that we will bounce back quicker and better than before.
Let's return to the Remède de Fortune. This is a great accomplishment of Machaut's. He uses the established poetic forme fixe, or fixed forms, of rondeau, violet, and ballade. And it shows his rootedness in the works of earlier literary works, wherein the narrator must learn how to deal with fickle fortune. But Machaut creates something new. Dr. Fasser says that as opposed to taking comfort in philosophy, or as in the Roman de Fauvel, where Fauvel tries to marry Lady Fortune, quote, "The narrator in the Remède takes his solace from Lady Hope, the inspiration of many a courtly lover," end quote.
We talked about the Roman de Fauvel, And so we talked about music being interpolated into a poem or into a text. And we have a brilliant example of that from Guillaume de Machaut, who was born in 1300 and died in 1377. So we have a piece that's written actually in the very year of plague, and it's written for his patron, who was about to, whose husband was about to become the King of France. And she died of the plague just before he was crowned. So she didn't live to see his good turn of fortune, as her own life was cut short. In any case, this is a poem about fortune. And it's about the existential quest, actually, of an artist to try to figure out why it is that he does his art. And at the beginning, he's being challenged very greatly by fortune, because his own fortune has, by Lady Fortune, because his own fortune has changed, been transformed, as has that of his patron, who has died. So he's worried about himself as an artist, and he's worried about, he's living in plague-raging times. He's living in the time of a horrible pandemic, where probably about a third to a half of the entire population died. So, our own pandemic pales by comparison with what's known as the Black Death, or the plague of the 14th century, in which he lived, and which colored much of his own life. So, what happens in this music is tremendously interesting, because you have many of the pieces written in the old style of notation, and then he comes to learn as an artist that his work does matter, because he brings joy to the community. And so his life as a composer and as a poet and as a performer is not of naught. And he's taught these things by hope. And so the answer, the remedy for fortune's challenge to human life, in the view of this particular poem, is to have hope. Is to have hope that no matter what happens to you, and no matter how difficult your life may be, that you do have hope for something better, or for learning something about yourself that you may not have known in the past. So this piece is written in the new style of notation that is known as the musical notation of the Ars Nova, that allows us to write many quick notes and longer notes and proportions of notes. And he writes, he comes to have hope himself. And he says, "My lady, to you without reservation I give my heart, my thought, my desire, my body, and my love, as to the very best woman who can be chosen, who can live or die in this time." So he learns in this poem not only to have hope, but he learns also to write for the community, and he also learns to write love poetry to the woman he cares about, if she accepts him or if she denies him, because he believes in the power of his art. And so he's no longer worried about whether or not that wheel is going to turn and she's going to say no thank you, or she's going to say yes to him, because the beauty is in the doing, and the beauty is in the music. And this is an incredibly lively piece which can be danced, which can be enjoyed by the whole community, and in which he uncovers the spirit of his own muse, Machaut does. And so you will hear in this particular piece how important the refrain is. And we talked about the importance of the refrain when we talked about the alba. Here it's even more important. So you will hear that particular parts of text come back, and particular notes come back also, and are repeated to different texts. So the actual form of the genre is made by the repetition of the refrain. So one of the things to listen to as you listen to this beautiful, lively piece is to see if you can hear the parts of the music that repeat and the parts of the text that repeat, and hear how it holds it all together.
Okay, now with some background on Machaut and the Black Death, let's hear an excerpt from the Remède de Fortune.
Dame, vous sans retenir, donc cœur, pensée, désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre, ne mourir, puis à ce jour. Si ne me doit à vouloir tourner ce jeu, vous amour, car sans mentir, bonté passées en valour, toute florant douce odeur qu'on peut sentir, votre beauté fait tarir, tout autre anéantir, et vos douceurs passe toute rose en couleur vous devez tenir, et vos regards peut guérir toute douleur. Dame, à vous sans retenir, donc cœur, pensée, désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre, ne mourir, puis à ce jour. Pour ce dame, je m'adoure de très toute ma vigueur à vous servir, et mes sans nul vilain pour mon cœur, ma vie et mon amour en vos plaisirs, et ce pitié consentir veut que me daigniez oïr en m'acclamant. Je ne quière de mon amour d'autre mérite, il ne me pourrait venir jouer grignou. Dame, sont huit mi-retours, souvent m'étuez en détours plaindre et gémir, et présent vous découleur, quand vous ne savez l'ardeur qu'est à souffrir, pour vous qu'aime tant des désirs, que plus nul ne puis couvrir, et ce tendre n'en avait en grand triste pour me tuer finir. Non, pourquoi jusqu'au mourir votre démon, dame, à vous sans retenir, donc cœur, pensée, désir, corps et amour, comme à toute la meilleure qu'on puisse choisir, ne qui vivre, ne mourir, puis à ce jour.
Now that you've heard that, we would love to hear from you. Knowing the story of the Remède de Fortune and its tragic connection to the Black Death, do you have a story of love and hope during our own pandemic that you can share? Please leave a G-rated version in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and these two fascinating works by Machaut. We've looked at how they reflect this growing sense of individualism and humanism that continues in the 14th century, and how this is connected to the works of other great artists like Giotto, Dante, and Petrarch. We've also heard about the Black Death that hit Europe in 1348, in a century already racked by war, famine, civil unrest, and a crisis of belief. The Ars Nova was the musical style that prevailed at the time. The 14th century musical style began with the Roman de Fauvel, circa 1310, and finished with the death of Guillaume de Machaut in 1377. In the next and final episode of this chapter, we're going to discuss Boccaccio and the reaction to the Black Death, what role the arts played, and hear some music that helps us understand life in this post-plague world and takes us into the final style of the late Middle Ages, the Ars Subtilior. Finally, please support us by liking this video, sharing it with friends, and leaving comments below. We love to hear from you. This helps us to reach new audiences and continue our work. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.